Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Oh, I bet it's driving you crazy I didn't finish singing that. Well, it's not just because I'm a terrible singer, and also not because you have OCD. Maybe you do, but I mean, that's not the reason why. In today's video, we're going to talk about how music and chord progressions work, and why it drove you crazy I didn't finish singing that scale. Music with Mike. Hey everyone, my name is Mike Hilbun and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about how chord progressions work and how a concept called tonal gravity will affect your expectations of the music you're listening to and in turn give you a certain sixth sense to be able to predict where the music you love is going to go next. So to get started, let's look at what was at work in that intro that might have driven you a little crazy, aside from my terrible singing. In the intro, I sang a major scale, but I left it unfinished and it sounded unresolved. So unresolved that you could probably predict what the next note I was going to sing would have been. And the fact that I left things so unresolved made your brain feel unsatisfied, musically speaking. Fine. You're welcome. The last note I sang in the intro is what's referred to as a tendency tone. Now with a name like that, you might be able to guess what a tendency tone is, but for those of you in the back, a tendency tone is a tone or note that has a tendency to want to move somewhere else or to be resolved to another note. When I left things off in the intro, it resulted in a little bit of musical tension. That tension demonstrated that note's tendency to want to resolve somewhere else and our innate desire to want to hear that note being resolved. That sense of tension and resolution is at the heart of how and why music and chord progressions work. Now, if you've been following my series so far, you know we've placed a lot of emphasis on the major scale, and that's because almost all of Western music, from Beethoven to Led Zeppelin to Cardi B,
what's poppin'?
is in some way related to the major scale. So let's quickly take a look at the tendency tones found in a major scale, that way we can get to the cool stuff. In a major scale, there are two main tendency tones that I'd like to talk about today. The strongest one is the seventh note in the scale. That's the one that I demonstrated in the intro. It has a really strong tendency to want to resolve up to the root of the scale. The second one is the fourth scale degree, which has a strong tendency to want to resolve down to the third note in the scale. It doesn't have quite a strong tendency as the seventh scale degree does, but it's definitely still there. It's kind of interesting to notice that the two tendency tones and the tones that they want to resolve to are the two pairs of half steps found in the major scale. Interesting. Well, all that is great, but I said we talk about how the music you love and chord progressions work, and so far I've talked about some lame scales. Well, let's get to the interesting stuff. So how does this all relate to chords? Well, if you've seen my video on chords, then you know that chords are just a group of notes played at the same time. If you haven't seen my video on chords, then, well. So if one of the notes in that chord is a tendency tone, then that chord's gonna have some tension to it, and that tension is gonna wanna be resolved. Now this concept doesn't work without some context. The human brain likes to identify patterns when it can, and it does the same thing when it listens to music. It doesn't take your brain very long to be able to identify where home base is, otherwise known as the tonal center. Just because a chord has, say, a B in it, doesn't necessarily mean that that chord will be tense. The context is incredibly important. So if you're listening to something in the key of C and you hear a chord with the note B in it, then that chord will have some tension because B is the seventh note in that scale. So let's check out how this works in the key of C. Using the key of C as an example, these are the chords in that key that have tendency tones in them. Even though we're talking about chords here, the tones will have the same tendencies that we discussed earlier. So a chord with the note B in it, which is the seventh scale degree, will have the tendency to want to resolve to a chord with the note C in it. Same thing for a chord with the note F in it, will want to resolve to one with an E in it. If you hear a chord with both tendency tones in it, the tension will be very, very strong. So let's look at how this works over a chord progression. If you've seen any of those videos that talk about the 4 chords of pop music, this is that progression. you can see why that chord progression works so well. It kind of meets all of your expectations as a listener. You guys like that segue? Hey guys, so I realized the next day while I was editing this, I never quite spelled out what tonal gravity is. So to put a definition on it, tonal gravity refers to the pull that a tonal center exerts on tense notes or chords to want to resolve to a more stable place. So simply put, the stronger the feeling of tension, the stronger the desire to resolve will be. Now, I feel like this is a great time to remind everybody that there are no hard and fast rules. Just because you have a chord with some tension in it doesn't mean you have to resolve it at all. I mean, just go check out the music in a horror movie. It's so tense because it's a horror movie. And of course, this isn't limited to just movie composers either. What if you're writing a really sad, tense song? I don't know, maybe about how your wife left you and she took your kids and took your car, and all you're left with is you and your guitar.
Just me and my guitar.
The point being is songwriters always have the option to defy your musical expectations. We've only been talking about the musical reasons as to why your brain or your ears might expect a certain chord progression to work. And all of this happens because, as I've demonstrated, there's a certain amount of gravity found within a key that wants to pull things back to the tonal center or pull things back home. So I think one last important thing to mention before I finally stop talking is chromatic notes. Up until now, we've talked about everything as it relates to being within a scale. Well, what about all the notes outside of that scale? You know, all the wrong notes that jazz musicians love to play. If you've already established your tonal center, then obviously all the wrong notes are going to have a very strong sense of tension to them, which if used correctly can lead to a very nice and strong resolution back to one of the right notes inside the key. That sense of gravity we mentioned earlier will feel very, very strong and should pull you right back to the right note inside the key. That's if you do it right and not just, play a wrong note and look out into the crowd like you messed up. Let's check out how this works over a progression. Did you hear how strongly that B flat note wanted to resolve back to that A note in the chord progression? And like I said, if handled correctly, this can lead to some really beautiful stuff. You can even have an entire chord made up of wrong notes, and it'll still work the same way. Check out how strongly this B flat minor chord wants to resolve to the A minor chord in this chord progression. So a lot of why the music you love works the way it does is because of how it plays to your expectations as a listener. Now, some of these things are expected simply just because we've heard them so many times, we know subconsciously where they're supposed to go. But the only reason those things worked in the first place is because of all these concepts such as tension and resolution, these tendency tones, and science. I'm sure there's some science in here somewhere. So the next time you listen to your favorite song, try to see if you can feel the tension found in the music itself, and maybe see if where it resolves to plays on or off of your musical expectations. Hey everyone, thanks for watching today's video. As always, if you have a question about something we talked about, leave a comment down below, or if you have an idea for a topic you'd like me to cover in a future video, let me know. Today's video was submitted by one of my viewers, so I do listen. If you liked today's video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. That's all for now. I'm Hilbun. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.